Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So I think we can begin. I think we're not waiting for anyone else to join in at the moment. And if there are, they can just trickle in as we're going through the presentations. So once again, good afternoon. My name is Beatrice Cassandra A. Carag. I'm from the Research Institute for the Futures of Education. And we are all here for the parallel session on the thematic area of geopolitics and socio-technological transitions in education. For this session, we have 7 presentations in store for us today. But before we begin, I would just like to give you a rundown of the topics that we will learn about today. So each speaker will have 10 minutes to talk, and we will be notifying our speakers when there are 2 minutes left to wrap up it via Zoom chat. We will be stopping at key points for our question and answer portion. So make sure to take note of your questions first, and we'll have ample time for discussion after the first and second sets of presentations. All right. So I will now be reading the presentations and the Q&A segments for this afternoon, and the order of which are as follows. So the first presentation is going to be The University as Community Hub, a new model for sustainability education in the age of AI by Sadaf Ansari. Next, that will be followed by Exploring Futures, Conversational AI, Early Childhood Cognitive Growth, and Climate Action Strategies in Southeast Asia. This will be presented by Ronald Gabriel D. Teng. And the third presentation of our first segment will be Philosophy Education in the Time of Gen AI. Notes on Collaborative and Indigenous Pedagogies in the Philippines. So after the 3 sessions, we will have a question and answer. But for Ms. Sadaf Ansari's presentation, we'll have a question and answer right after, because I think she'll have to leave right after her presentation. Okay, so that's the first segment. So we'll then follow with a second segment, where we'll start with the emerging forces of change of Islamic education in BARMM, insights, opportunities, and challenges by Jean-Ric D. Nunez. And then we'll follow post-conflict pedagogies and transitions, interrogating the prospects of critical climate education in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao by Sumaya Kali Padilla. The last 2 presentations will be Weakening Climate Resilience, STEM Education, Green Skills, and the Green Brain Drain of Filipino STEM Students and Professionals by Mary Crisangelic Jacob Buslay. And last presentation will be The Future of Higher Education Leadership in Malaysia, a preliminary inquiry on the Envisioning Malaysia 2050, a foresight narrative. And this will be presented by Sally B. Gutierrez. Okay. And then after these 4 presentations, we'll have another round of question and answers to wrap up our session. All right. So that's the order of presentations for today. And I think without further ado, Ms. Sadaf, are you ready to present? So I'd like to call on our first presentation for today. So Ms. Sadaf Ansari from the Ridgeview Residential College of the National University of Singapore, presenting the University as Community Hub, a new model for sustainability education in the age of AI.
Hi, thank you. Wonderful. I'll share my screen now. All right. I hope everyone's looking at my screen. Is that correct?
Yep.
Oh,
Yes,
wonderful.
we can see your screen.
Okay, excellent. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm very mindful of the time. It's around 1:34, so I'll keep to time most importantly. Getting started. I teach at a residential college within the bigger institution, which is National University of Singapore. I've been teaching at NUS for 11 years. Throughout this time, all the courses I've taught are pegged to Sustainable Development Goals. And along the way, I've had time and opportunity to think about how to move forward, especially for ESD. And then, of course, along the way have been multiple threats and challenges to education, including MOOCs at one point, and then along the way came the pandemic, and then most recently the advent of AI, which NU especially has geared up to take on wholesale and adopt for its staff and students in teaching learning completely. So with this kind of rapid change, I think I'd like to invite everyone to think about. I think for a lot of universities, this also presents a moment of reckoning where a lot of us are wondering, what is the future? How does the university position itself as AI is continuing to evolve as a technology and hugely impacting teaching learning processes and modes. The written essay is a problematic mode for assessment now. How about open book exams, closed book exams? How are we framing? How are we going to test? And most importantly, what do we need to teach? And within this context, I want to draw your attention to something that's not that new, actually. The UNESCO 2021 framework, which talks about the reimagining of our futures for education, actually set about a new social contract for education, from which I kind of want to frame the inquiry that I want to share with you today. And it highlights five key anchors for that. It highlights pedagogies of solidarity and cooperation. These are very human traits, very valuable in the age of AI. They're talking about curriculum and knowledge commons, which means to expand the boundary into a common space, and taking away the notion of privilege from universities. Giving renewed respect to teachers in the teaching profession is another key pillar that this report talks about. And then it talks about safeguarding and transforming schools, maybe not so pertinent definitely to Singapore, but potentially in some Southeast Asian countries, certainly in South Asia, where the act of going to school, perhaps let's say in Afghanistan for girl students to go to school, is something that cannot be taken for granted. And then globally, talking about education across different times and spaces. And here I refer to a conversation we had earlier this morning about where does one learn? Does one only learn in the classroom? Should one only learn in the classroom? And what is the value of teaching and learning that is restricted to a classroom setting? Lots of questions. Let's try and see if there are any potential ideas that we can take. And here I propose the universities as a community hub model. What I'm trying to say is, can we now consider positioning the university as actually a dynamic node of civic engagement? So it's not about knowledge and skill acquisition. It's actually very much conceptually anchored to civic engagement, where teaching, research, and community actually all come together. What might that look like? We want to bridge theory and practice. We want to develop modes for action research, and we want to forge partnerships with local communities so that we are informed by the present context to where the university is, in order for learning to no longer be abstract, and for universities to take on the responsibility, a civic responsibility, not just to everyone who's within the university, but to everyone else who's around. And some ideas are expressed here. So, key to this is to adopt an interdisciplinary lens on how we want to approach education moving forward. There are several overlapping pedagogic traditions that one can tap into. There's service learning, of course, there's community-based participatory research, and of course, democratic civic universities. So you'll see, we're talking about theory of knowledge. We're also starting to look at aspects of sociology and how to involve communities in a very respectful and human way. We're going to have to look at urban planning, because most universities, not all, tend to be located in urban centers. And lastly, there are huge implications. And here I want to hark upon One Health, the idea of one planet approach, and taking it all together in how we move forward to direct learning to champion these causes directly, not as an afterthought. For those of you who are familiar with pedagogic literature, I always find John Dewey's work very inspiring. In his book written all the way in 1916, he actually strongly advocated for democracy and education being intertwined. And he's basically talking about learning being a social process where students have the agency to construct understanding and meaning through experience rather than passive instruction. He's also talking about an ethical grounding and doing public good. In that comes the UNESCO ESG framework and their report on transforming futures, where they are talking about a global shift in sustainability education away from studying about carbon emissions purely or GHG emissions, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and tracking down the data on that, but actually embedding it in the university as a practice, which means universities now carry the burden of modeling the change that the community is then expected to follow through with. So then clearly there are some emerging ESG priorities that universities need to start working on immediately. Clearly we need green skills development, not theoretical, but actually application based. This needs to be powered by digital transformation because we wish to scale change. And lastly, all along, I've been talking about the human aspect, especially in AI, the social emotional aspect of learning. So over here, one way of operationalizing is these are students on a field trip studying about urban greening projects. That's the gardener in charge of an urban greening project, and he's sharing exactly what the modes and the green skills are for doing that. They offer internships and then talking about how digital technology is embedded within these practices with computerized irrigation systems, live monitoring, etc. So it's kind of an intersection of various skills. In this setting, experiential learning, if I may propose, is a possible modality. Because obviously, green skills need digitally literate workers who can use clean technology. Digital transformation on its own requires socially and emotionally grounded learners who can navigate the very difficult questions AI is posing to us. And lastly, social emotional learning provides the motivation and values foundation that can actually take ESD forward. We also need to increasingly engage cross-engational stakeholder through direct dialogue and reflection. This is an example of students engaging with graveyard caretakers in an old, disused Chinese cemetery to one hark back on familial ties and roots to different parts, not just in Singapore, not just within ASEAN, but all the way to China, Asia, and beyond. The idea that you can directly engage the stakeholder on the ground is something that experiential learning would empower. With that comes the strategic integration of AI. Is this a perfect model? No. But essentially, AI has certain inherent strengths, enhanced personal learning, data-informed decision making, and the ability to scale really quickly. I share an example. This is a digital solution crafted by my students for upgrading a space on campus. This is a live project. The students come from different disciplines and were empowered by their use of AI in generating this visual, as you can see, which otherwise would have been really tricky for them. And they're using AI not to just generate a solution, but they're using AI as a tool to stitch all these different ideas together. So I'm talking about human-centered use of AI, where AI doesn't just replace human judgment, but used thoughtfully. There's also the idea, another example where students have actually proposed a live intervention to scale, fully thought out. And this is the power of AI, which enables students to scale up very quickly their intervention. Other ESG priorities that universities have so far often left behind are those of equity, cultural diversity, and community resilience. Another example is this place-based learning, where students are actually engaging directly with an ice cream sandwich seller at the Padang, which is a heritage site. The idea that you have to change dialect to speak with him, to interrupt his workflow, and to understand from his perspective how tourism is impacting him. So these are underexplored dimensions of ESD that often get left behind. And I'm calling upon everyone to think who's here in the panel today to see these as opportunities that are empowering for ESD to be meaningful. Practical recommendations, I think earlier in the morning, and I know I'm about to run out of time, there were discussions about looking inwards. We're increasingly looking outward. This is an image on the right is from students in Malaysia at Borneo and Sarawak engaging with the local people and learning from them. So the idea is we need to scale place-based approaches with community partnerships, not just in the cities, but getting out of the cities, to adopt whole institution sustainability strategies, to role model the changes that we want to save, and then to link educational pathways to green careers in a very intentional way. If anyone's interested, my slides also have some considerations. Don't have all the answers, and context-based solutions will probably pose some operational um, accountability and outcomes-based questions that are very valid. With this, and a call for everyone to start considering the change of AI as empowering, but also something to be handled carefully, I end my presentation. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you very much, Ms. Sadaf Ansari, for that wonderful presentation and very insightful presentation. I really love what you've talked about, providing concrete implementation framework for a lot of universities. Right. And I think so now we'll open the floor for questions, comments, reactions. Please type your queries on the Zoom chat if you have any. Okay, so I do have a question. So, field schools are emerging as a model of education that integrates disciplinal theories outside the classroom.
Mhm.
So, do you see this playing a big role in the changing identity of the university?
Absolutely. I think that for a very long time, there's been sort of like a centralization of the model or the operational modalities that the university can or should perhaps execute learning through. And increasingly, due to various changes, even before AI, through the pandemic, I think there is an increasing thrust towards that decentralization process. And I think field schools contribute very meaningfully to that by helping. I think in terms of place-based and experiential, they offer a very ready solution. Now, the only question that one would wonder is scalability, because the universities for a while now, formal universities, have become large scale. And so my concern would be um, direct scalability. But then I'm a huge proponent, by training, I'm an architect and urbanist, and I'm a huge proponent of like nucleating the city, not single nucleus, but multi-nucleated cities. And so as the megapolis grows, instead of the core and the nucleus becoming large, I think having it disperse into multiple nuclei is a good example. And similarly, perhaps there is potential in exploring a decentralized model of the university as a testing ground for realistic scalability that still remains meaningful.
All right, thank you very much for answering my question. All right, so I think we have time for one more question. So you talked about many moving parts in the community hub model, right? So there's action research, service learning, ESD frameworks, AI integration, whole institution strategy. So in your experience, what are the challenges and bottlenecks that a university can expect in terms of implementation? And I ask this especially for, especially given the context that universities operate in with different capacities, right, in different contexts. So what advice, right, would you or can you give universities who might wanna take a stab, right, at this model, but may face like these challenges and bottlenecks?
Um, yeah, I think that's usually at one should begin by considering challenges so that one knows how to nudge them into opportunities for intervention. If I may share with you four, perhaps. In terms of operations, and I'm very mindful of that, it's not always easy for that model to lend itself um, to operationalization if the community needs don't directly align with the availability of research funding. Because research funding sometimes has its constraints. And if we want to channel doing good into a certain direction, both action research and also community partnerships, they need to have that alignment. And that is not always something we can take for granted. So that would be one challenge directly. Um, the other thing might be, I'm an educator. Um, I feel great and strong about this. But what does it mean for other educators as they shift from a more traditional mode of being an educator into becoming a facilitator? And then how do we get on board educators who might be a bit more hesitant and resistant to move away? Because we haven't even perfected classroom teaching. There's always some room for improvement. And then you're talking about throwing in an external community partner and meeting their needs halfway and then solutioning and executing it on the ground. And that can seem like a big ask for educators. So that would be another challenge. Of course, the opportunity would be one of the opportunities would be just like we encourage our students to participate in these projects with the carrot that you will actually be change agents. Like physically in the community, you will be implementing change. I think that's very empowering because the scale of an educator's impact then suddenly is not their students anymore. And the scale of the impact for professional satisfaction, personal and ethical reasons suddenly becomes the community that you are working with. So yeah, it's a challenge, but then also can be an opportunity.
All right. Thank you very much. And I think that's all the time that we have with Sadaf for today. So I think I'll call on the next presentation. So again, thank you very much for your time, Sadaf. I know that you have to leave. Very insightful presentation once again. So I'll now call on our next speaker, Exploring Futures, a conversational AI, early childhood cognitive growth, and climate action strategies in Southeast Asia, to be presented by Ronald Gabriel D. Teng.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing the screen. So, hi everyone. So, my name is Ronald and mabuhay at magandang hapon. I'm currently the former facilitator of the Artificial Intelligence Academy in the Philippines in support with the Department of Information, Communication, and Technology of the country, or DICT, with the collaborations of Rotary and Cada Career, both are NGOs or social enterprises. It's a bit segmented or decentralized in the sense that we teach AI to people or to young children so that they can solve big problems such as ecological megatrends, such as climate action. So next slide, please. So, in this particular discussion, we're going to explore strategy. So, how can we use AI with climate action? I know it's a bit confusing or ironic, specifically that AI and sustainability should not go hand in hand in one sentence. So, next slide, please. Um, I want to ask a question. When a 6 years old talks to artificial intelligence or AI bots and naturally treat them as a real friend with feelings, are we unlocking an incredible new way to teach them to care for our planet, for sustainability, or are we just handling cover the roots of human empathy and connection to a talking machine? Basically, do the children knows that an AI is just a tool but not a human being? Next slide, please. So, in the big megatrend, we know that we have a convergent landscape. We have demographic shift and we have climate vulnerability. As in the Philippines right now, we experience high level of rain and zero visibility, maybe perhaps for climate change. And of course, we are in the fourth industrial revolution, which is the rise of AI. Moving forward, next slide, please, is that there is current problem in this particular trend. Number one is that developing minds, or 6 to 7 years old, present a critical window where technological disruption deeply influence their worldview. What they see or what they talk or what they see in social media or with AI bot is often what they reflect in real life. We have the term algorithmic anthropomorphism, meaning that the youth population remains highly susceptible to giving vitalistic properties and human emotion to non-living or inanimate objects, such as AI bots, such as social media platforms, Meta AI, Gemini AI, and the like. There's a trend right now in social media in which young children or even teenagers have this particular AI boyfriend, AI girlfriend, or AI friend. They talk to them quite often. And next is that we have to understand the relation dynamic for designing approaches in leveraging AI as a transformative tool for sustainable education. Earlier, it was discussed that AI can be a powerful tool, so why not use it in solving one of the big problems, such as climate education or sustainable education? Next slide, please. In this particular objective, we want to understand the mechanism of how particular children or child interact with AI agents. And we want to analyze the risk and efficiency, and of course, to anticipate particular strategies in real life scenarios in education. Moving forward is that in our methodology, next slide please, is that we want to create anticipatory using CLA or causal ledger analysis, meaning we're going to foresight using 4 layers. The first one is litany, the trends, the surface level that we can see, the systemic causes or the structures in our society, the worldview, the paradigms, and of course, the meat and metaphor by using scenario archetypes and thematic analysis. Next slide, please. For our key findings and diagnosis, we learn that, next slide please, um, there is a theory between children age 6 to 7 that they actively recruit the theory of mind, meaning that they particularly assign emotion or vitalytic properties for relations with non-living object. It's a bit sad. I see this in the classroom in AI Academy, in which they are far more open to conversing with AI agents rather than asking the teachers for questions because they're afraid that the teacher will be wrong or the teacher will scold them if they got the answer incorrect. Next slide, please, is that we also learn that there is an AI integrated pedagogy, meaning conversational AI is good in creating localized context-specific narrative. It can create a particular answer suited just for you, suited just for the children. So why not we bridge this particular technologies together? We learn that, next slide please, that CLA of artificial intelligence and climate education can go hand in hand. Meaning, in the litany CLA layer, we can observe surface level events such as rising climate anxiety and the unregulated influx of generative AI and use that to solve the particular crisis that we're currently having. In the systemic causes, we learn that we don't have particular governance yet in the Philippines or in other ASEAN Asias with regards to the use of AI. Though we have policies in the universities or in areas, in workshops on how to use AI, but big laws covering this, not so much. Next is that in the ideological paradigms, we learn that there is a bit of tension between techno-solutionism and authentic ecological influences. Um, Moving forward is that we also see that there is the shift, or we want to aim a shift between education as a factory to training or trajectorying it into a learning as an interconnected web, meaning everything is connected like as the Internet of Things. So due to this particular event or understanding, we develop a particular framework. We call it Education Co-Regulation Framework. So in this particular framework, we aim to particularly create a system where the centralized learning, such as workshop or AI Academy, can create particular strategies to use AI as a leverage in solving particular problems. Number one is the epistemological framing that educators must simply teach children that AI is not a living person. It's an advanced tool so that they can mitigate the cognitive load of anthropomorphism, so they do not associate it with real person. Next is guided learning or guided interaction through joint media engagement, meaning that if AI is there currently, educators are the facilitators of learning, acting as the emotional buffer to prevent children from seeking validation from algorithm. You're there to support the learning, validate what AI is doing, and you give what AI cannot give, which is the emotional support. And next is the physical world anchoring. This is to overcome digital narrative. So we can create particular tactile or physical movement um, with AI to solve big problems or to learn big concepts. For example, waste sorting using AI, detecting what type of waste is it, while also doing manual labor of showing the children or facilitating a workshop or an activity about um, the particular waste. Next slide, please. I cannot show the particular strategies all at once due to the virtue of time, but I would like to end with a particular quote that the development of AI in education transcends more technological adoption. It is rigorous exercise in ethical stewardship. I know it's not perfect, to be honest. There's a lot of ethical questions that we're currently having here. Even right now, but I do hope that next time is that we can leverage AI for the better in solving mega trends such as sustainability. Um, Lastly, next slide, please. And to empower a sustainable future. So once again, my name is Ronald, with my partner, Coach Kia Angeles Carmela, and thank you very much for listening. Maraming salamat po.
Right. So thank you very much, Ronald. And so that was Ronald Gabriel Teng from the Biology Department of Far Eastern University. So yeah. So we'll have a round of question and answer. So after the next presentation, and that will be for this segment. So I'll now call on the next presentation, Philosophy, Education in the Time of Gen AI, Notes on Collaborative and Indigenous Pedagogies in the Philippines, presented by Marielle Antoinette H. Zosa.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. Okay. Hold on a second. Okay. All right. I think it can be seen now, and I hope I'm audible. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marielle from the Department of Philosophy. So, I'd like to make a disclaimer. I'm basically just going to propose some strategies with regard to the topic at hand. The effectiveness of my proposals or suggestions, of course, have yet to be seen. As I am a philosophy major, I'm not a social scientist. So, okay, I'll start. Generative artificial intelligence, or Gen AI, has posed immense benefits and challenges in education, particularly in philosophy as a discipline within the humanities. The benefits of Gen AI in teaching and learning include time-saving efficiency, potential for autonomous self-education, more inclusive accessibility to educational tools, among others. However, downsides may include the undermining of critical higher-order thinking skills, loss of agency due to over-reliance on technology, and exacerbation of educational inequality through propagation of misinformation. So therefore, humanities disciplines like philosophy must review their assessment methods for students to emphasize genuine, humanistic, and student-centered interaction. So in reviewing assessment methods to offset these challenges brought about by AI in philosophy, I argue for collaborative pedagogies as forms of contextual learning particular to the Philippine setting. So to contextualize collaborative pedagogies, I propose to further transform existing Philippine indigenous research methods as collaborative learning approaches. I posit that effective ways to mitigate the downsides of Gen AI in education are to one, reinforce human collaboration in constructing learning agendas to avoid technological over-reliance, and two, culturally situate learning processes to direct students toward real-life context building. And so more specifically, culturally sensitive collaborative pedagogies, which I include just in this presentation, are pakikipagkwentuhan or kwentuhan, storytelling, pagtatanong-tanong, asking questions around, and ginabayang talakayan or collective focus group discussions. So in my brief presentation, I aim to discuss the following. First, I'll give a brief background to the state of philosophical education in today's era of Gen AI in terms of the most common learning assessment, the philosophical essay or paper. Second, I will introduce select indigenous research methods, which I claim may be indigenous collaborative forms of contextual learning. And in the latter part, I end with some tentative notes on how these decolonial types of pedagogies may enhance both teaching effectiveness and student-centric education in the global AI-driven revolution. For the background of the problem, the essay is the most common teaching assessment in philosophy classes. However, it is also not uncommon to find that students nowadays have easy access to Gen AI tools and chatbots such as ChatGPT and Gemini. Students and even professionals have a decision to use these AI tools in varying tiers, some deemed more acceptable than others, according to this 2025 article by Chen and Company. Some students may use these tools for grammar, spelling, readability, language translation. These AI-assisted practices are generally acceptable. Others may use these tools for generating outlines, summarizing content, improving clarity, brainstorming ideas. These AI-assisted practices are ethically contingent depending on the discipline, but for disciplines like philosophy, the second tier may not be acceptable. Finally, some individuals may use AI tools for drafting entirely new texts, developing novel concepts, interpreting data, and reviewing literature, among others. For the most part, use of Gen AI here is not recommended. So in the philosophy classroom, however, the extent of acceptable use of Gen AI is still an ongoing debate. On the one hand, if you argue from a point of view of a Kantian ethics, the use of Gen AI in writing papers is considered as cheating, constitutes the loss of a capacity, and robs away writing as thinking. Instead, one has a duty to cultivate and respect one's autonomy through writing autonomously to cultivate your humanity. And such a view reveals the disadvantages of AI use in writing papers. However, some also argue that philosophers have an obligation to develop, theorize, and even use philosophically relevant AI, since AI tools continue to progress in terms of recommending useful content, synthesizing existing literature, systematizing philosophical positions, simulating the believer of a certain position, and reasoning philosophical positions out. Philosophers should consequently have the obligation to advance philosophy concurrent with relevant technological progress. The second view reveals the advantages of AI use in writing papers. I claim that while use of Gen AI in the essay assessment in philosophy may yield detrimental effects to the student's autonomy, the potential benefits of honing relevant philosophical skills through AI are and will be continuously present and cannot be dismissed. Instead, I agree with Corbin and Company that educators must develop holistic assessments that rely less on the usual prefixed criteria for a learning activity and more on the disciplinal expertise of the teacher. Most importantly, holistic assessments in a time of Gen AI should treat students as fellow evaluators and collaborators whose thinking should be continuously probed and developed instead of being made to comply with set standards for grading. So this leads me, to the second part of my presentation, where I introduce some possible holistic assessments through Philippine Indigenous research methods, which have the potential to be transformed into collaborative and contextual pedagogies. And I must make first some disclaimers. So first, I make tentative notes on these three pedagogies because of their collaborative nature, needed to enhance the philosophical learning environment in today's AI-driven world. And second, I choose an Indigenous/decolonial approach to holistic assessment as the standards generated by AI on which academic outputs are based on may marginalize Indigenous oral and experiential modes of knowledge in favor of Western-centric epistemologies. So collaboration on the one hand and context on the other treat the student as critical evaluators who go beyond preset compliance standards to deeply enrich the learning environment. So first is pakikipagkwentuhan or sometimes kwentuhan. Perhaps it's more an easily identifiable teaching approach when modified. It is an informal, free-flowing process of exchanging information, thoughts, and knowledge in a bidirectional manner. So participants therefore can ask the researcher questions and to share their own stories, with the goal in mind is to produce a story or stories that can be analyzed. Paklibar argues that kwentuhan is a communicative practice that performatively resists the colonial assumptions of a Western model Philippine educational system and counters the individualizing tendency of Western model of education. Second, pagtatanong-tanong or asking questions around is marked by remarkable casualness when the inquirer is truly determined to get answers to their questions. Some major features of this method include participatory nature, and the participant has an input in the structure of the interaction in terms of defining its direction and in terms of time management. Second, that the researcher and participant are equal in status. Both parties may ask questions for about the same length of time, and it is appropriate and adaptive to the conditions of the group of participants, in that it conforms to existing group norms. Lastly, ginabayang talakayan is very much like a focus group discussion, except for one element: the researcher and participants collectively decide on the topics of discussion and the flow of this discussion. According to Galvez, it is a method of collective research where a group of participants engage in sharing and exchanging knowledge, experience, and opinions on a topic they collectively agreed to discuss. And with these, for the lack of time, I conclude with some short future notes on how to proceed with transforming these Indigenous research methods into Indigenous pedagogies in the time of AI. And so one must translate the researcher into the teacher and the participant into the student. So first, pakikipagkwentuhan or kwentuhan as a conversation or narration is a form of both collaborative and contextual learning that may suit in-person oral philosophical activities or even group discussions on how to write papers. If GenAI is advanced enough to be incorporated in a philosophy subject as an interlocutor, the student can engage in pakikipagkwentuhan with a chatbot to philosophically analyze each other's stories or conversations. Second, pagtatanong-tanong as asking around can also be used as a collaborative and contextual pedagogy that may maintain a level of peer-to-peer informality which may not yet totally be mimicked by AI. Instead of fixating on measuring pre-assigned rubrics, the teacher as expert must gauge the level of philosophical inquiry in such an activity. If a GenAI chatbot again is again incorporated into the subject, students may also perform pagtatanong-tanong on it and evaluate the tool's questions so as not to take everything the system generates at face value. And finally, ginabayang talakayan as a collective group discussion is also collaborative and contextual because it must also be expertly handled by the teacher as facilitator so that the learning agenda is set as one cooperative body. This may be very similar to a community of inquiry approach as popularized by philosophy for or with children. And as an oral activity or a pre-workshop toward writing a paper, ginabayang talakayan may be a fruitful holistic assessment. If, again, Gen AI chatbots themselves become part of the discussion, the collaborative and contextual dialogue, when properly managed by the teacher, will still hopefully develop relevant critical philosophizing students. I hope to use all of these assessment tools when I teach philosophy to undergrad students and how they write philosophical papers. And that's it for my presentation. I hope I didn't go over time. These are my references. And yeah, thank you for listening.
All right. So thank you very much, Ms. Marielle Zosa, for that presentation. So I really appreciate the use of Indigenous pedagogies as well and inserting that in the conversation in AI, right? And for Ronald Teng, I think it was very insightful of you to lay out for everyone the mitigating effects, right, of AI in the digital transfer deficit. So we'll now open the floor for any questions. I think there was an earlier question for Ronald Deng. This is from Adrian Gabriel of CSSP. Is it not contradictory to employ and develop AI-based education for environmental conservation and sustainability when AI data centers are a threat to the same?
Hello. Am I audible? All right. Good. Thank you. That's a very good question, to be honest. And I think there are two main concerns here. Number one, it is not contradictory. Why? Because AI tools right now is very important in conservation. As a biologist, we use it. I want to share a bit of what we share to the children when we teach AI. There's no such thing as of the moment as true AI. We have what we call machine learning. So meaning, people are the one who codes the algorithm, who creates the algorithm to make it fitted for a particular industry, for example, for environmental conversation or to detecting microplastic or macroplastic in the environment. So the issue with AI data center is that it's not because of AI itself, but the government or the governance between with the governance with the AI data centers. It's important to understand that the purpose of the study is to determine strategies to use AI in early development, such as the age of 6 to 7. And then one of the big problems here really is that, as I mentioned earlier, is that it's a bit unregulated. during our time right now. So I hope in the future we have strong institution and strong laws with creating data centers, because as much as I want to be respectful in a way or to be professional, we all rely with data centers. Zoom uses it, Facebook, email uses it, so we cannot move away from data center. The question is, where do we put the data center? How do we manage the effect of the data center? Because every benefit has a co-destruction framework or a co-destruction impact. So for me, that will be my answer. I hope it answers your question. Salamat po.
Thank you, Ronald. So, question for Marielle. So, Marielle, Gen AI's language is English and prompting is largely English, right? So, in your indigenous pedagogies, right, and your collaborative model, how do you think language fits into that? Or is that something that you're currently thinking about?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Ms. Bea. Well, the truth is, I mentioned it in passing, and the reason why I particularly chose a more indigenous approach to teaching, especially philosophy, that for the longest time has really been about meeting certain set criteria and rubrics, and if you don't meet it, then you kind of don't get a good grade. And AI challenges that. And the thing about language, and I do agree that, and I'm sorry, it was a very interesting point, but due to the lack of time, I couldn't emphasize on it much further, is that since you have this thing called data colonialism, and, all forms of technology and all forms of innovation, they're never neutral. And it depends on, well, basically at the end of the day, who oversees, manages it, or what entity manages or supervises it. And so, if anything, this is why indigenous knowledge systems are at risk. But I'm not saying AI can't come up with a solution for that. And if anything, um, we should learn how to reorient AI in such a way that it accommodates properly and appropriately indigenous knowledge systems. Even if you use AI to translate Filipino text, when you translate it to English, it's not going to be exactly accurate, or something that we would probably parang raise eyebrows, and that's not the correct translation. Because yes, Western centric, when we talk about the use of AI, how it's being managed and supervised now, there is a tendency for it to be Western centric, whether it's based on English or other, I guess, higher powers, geopolitical powers at play. And so indigenous ways of learning, I think, can best at the moment, while we're still having this conversation about data colonialism. And probably indigenous ways of learning, contextual, collaborative, can in many ways do things that AI currently cannot. I cannot say in the future it won't replace that style of learning. I don't want to discount that fact, but as of the present, and this is an opportunity. It's a challenge for AI, but it's an opportunity for in-class learning, maybe hybrid learning, even asynchronous learning for that matter, is that we go back to our contextual roots. Yeah, but I think that's a really great point that you've raised. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have one last question from Sally Gutierrez. And this is for Marielle. How can Gen AI be used in philosophy education without marginalizing indigenous knowledge systems and locally grounded ways of knowing in the Philippines?
Thank you. I kind of touched upon that, but I will have to say that the way that we teach philosophy, even in the Philippines, their orientation is in itself quite Western. Whether here in UP or in other schools in Ateneo, and I'm sure. And this is why it's so great as well, not just to talk about how we will be using generative AI to improve the philosophy classroom condition, but also to go back to how we learn and teach philosophy itself. And so I'm a big fan of indigenizing, as you know, especially philosophy. And this is an area wherein, this is something that for the longest time, since we've taught our students to master German or Greek philosophy, but to have our own and to cultivate our own indigenous knowledge system, apart from the use of Gen AI, but going back to, well, what is philosophy for us in the first place? And I think that's also something that we have to reorient ourselves culturally, not just the use of AI, but the way that we do philosophy, especially in our country. So yeah, thank you for that question. It's really great.
Okay. So that's all the time that we have, right on time, right? And that ends the first segment of our session for today. So we'll now move on to the second set of presentations. We'll begin this segment, right, with the emerging forces of change of Islamic education in BARMM, insights, opportunities, and challenges. And this will be presented by Jean-Ric D. Nunez.
Thank you, Bea. Good afternoon, everyone. May I share my screen? Okay, hold on. Please don't start my time yet. Thank you. Okay. All right, I'll begin. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jean-Ric from RIFE. Together with Bea, we wrote the paper entitled Emerging Forces of Change of Islamic Education in BARMM, Insights, Opportunities, and Challenges. I'd like to begin with the context that BARMM, formerly known as ARMM, Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, for a very long time has struggled in its pursuit for self-determination because of various forces that limit their potential to establish a kind of education that they want for its own system. They struggle because of American nationalist agenda, prolonged armed conflict, and minorization of its religious beliefs, among many others. However, in 2019, when the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region Muslim Mindanao was finally established, the region gained both political and educational autonomy through its very own Ministry of Basic, Higher, and Technical Education, which grants BARMM administrative independence from the centralized Manila-based education bureaucracy. So as we see here, finally they were able to establish and navigate their own education agenda and establish its own system. So it is in the interest of our study then to explore, since there are several studies now that investigate education practices in BARMM. We felt like there's a dearth of study exploring emerging trends and signals in BARMM that they need to anticipate so they can establish an education that is truly their own. So therefore, the RQ that we have for this study is from the perspective of the key educational players, what are the emerging trends and signals in BARMM that would impact the future of education in the region? For this study, we're coining the term forces of change, and we're using STEEP as a way to interpret our data, our framework for the study. So we coined forces of change as a way to consolidate what we call in futures thinking weak signals, trends, disruptions, innovation, or any emerging patterns that may cause exponential implications and tensions in the future. What we do here in the study is that we collected these forces of change as we put it, and then consolidate them on the basis of the STEEP framework, where we categorize them based on whether they are social, technological, environmental, economic, and political. And while we try to categorize them, we also understand that they intermingle, they work together, and that they influence one another. So we also try to explore how these forces of change might also impact one another. So for this study, what we did is that last year our team went to BARMM, and we facilitated interviews with school administrators, classroom teachers, parents, and even a teacher student from both public and private schools, basic ed and also higher ed. And we also conducted semi-structured interview during our site visits. So for the succeeding slides, I'll be showing you the common themes or the dominant themes that transpired during our interviews. So clearly what's happening now in BARMM, and this is what we will say as its strongest vision at the moment, its most dominant force of change, is that there's clearly growing economy and professionalization in the region. What do we mean by this? So BARMM is recorded as one of the most potentially fastest growing economy in the Philippines because of its natural resources. And even its government itself has shifted its agenda from moral governance to what it calls mas matatag na Bangsamoro, or much stronger Bangsamoro. So because of this agenda setting that they have for the region, what happens now is that there's a shift from how they treat or perceive their education. They see education as a way to form human capital investment. This means education for long-term economic stability and upward mobility. So there's also an increasing preference for educational credentials and such. And because of that, material incentives that they associate with education, there's increased participation among stakeholders. For instance, they hired in 2024 around 4,000 teachers, and they also constructed 700 classrooms. So because of that, in as much as they want to establish a particular agenda for themselves, of course, as they go and try to establish that, there's also challenges that they need to take into account. And first among those is social and economic condition of teachers and students. So they are rife with challenges, considering number one, the need for socio-emotional learning, where they need to address trauma from decades-long conflict and strife. Second is that there's also increasing number of congested classrooms due to increased participation. In fact, one of our interviewees admitted that before he handled for a kindergarten classroom up to 15 students in a class, but now a kindergarten classroom reaches up to 50 students. Not to mention that there are also weather-related disruptions, and at the same time, main pain point of the teachers is that there are bottlenecks in promotion despite available slots. And for the students, especially from those lower income families, the hidden cost of education continued to impede their access for learning. Another consideration that our key informants have is the evolving economic priorities and individual aspirations. While there's a clear direction now with BARMM when it comes to market valued skills and individual economic priorities, some of our key respondents felt that it conflicts with their religious and communal roles. For instance, some teachers were observed to prioritize multiple income streams at the expense of fulfilling their work as teachers, and that religious scholars such as ustads in the community struggle to find jobs due to lack of professional credentials, which indicates that there seems to be a gap between how religion is prioritized and at the same time how the economy is growing and how it's difficult for religious individuals to keep themselves at pace with that demand. So there's a growing premium on secular skills in the region, which need to be negotiated with their religious and communal life. And also there's changing learning landscape and learner attitudes. What they say here is that there's unrelenting influence of technology in learning and teaching, and even in the private spaces of both teachers and students. Number one, they say that learners become much more independent. They're much more ready to go to school, and they have access to the several languages, such as English, and that they have easy access to information. But second of all, and this is the concern comes in, AI and tech tools, while they allow proliferation of information and all that, it also promotes learning dependency, and teachers observe that there's the skilling happening among students and that there's also cognitive offloading happening. So they say that technology at the same time is a window to cultural values and beliefs that may not necessarily align with Islamic views, which leads to reshaping student behavior and attitude. And teachers remark that some of the students and the associated with access to social media and conflicting values tend to be overfamiliar, to be self-expressive excessively, and to cross certain boundaries. Lastly, the fourth and another important factor to consider here is that they say that education is a way to establish future leadership amidst political constraints. However, there are things to consider here. Key informants say that education, the way they see it now, is a pathway for progressive social and political leadership in the region. However, they're facing two problems here. Number one, BARMM is known for deeply rooted clan-based political groups, which would make it difficult for aspiring educated leaders to lead the region, as these families can consolidate their power to continue their political legacy. But second, they feel like schools are dependent on the political and material power of politicians. This means that the intermingling between politicians and education institutions might complicate the purpose of education and in its capacity to enact change. So as we see here, there's a clear vision of BARMM, which is economic prosperity, with mas matatag na Bangsamoro agenda. However, this comes with conflicting consequences as well as conflicting interests. With technology, we see access to information and independent learning coincide with this skilling and cognitive offloading. Changing learning attitudes leading to self-expressiveness, but also unyielding behavior and tendency to challenge conformist practices, which threaten preservation of Islamic culture. And there's also issues on increased stakeholder participation, where sure, it promotes higher student enrollment, but also poses challenge on infrastructure and teacher support, and education for future leadership, where there's a formation of new emergent leaders, but also a way for political dynasties to consolidate its power to remain itself in power. So what we conclude here is that BARMM is at a crossroads. Our study aims to provide provocations, name the roads the region is facing, and hopefully inform them of the available options, guiding them which road to take. And that we hope that BARMM would consider exploring not just the past, but also the present, and anticipate what lies ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jean-Ric. So Jean-Ric is from the Research Institute of the Futures of Education in Ateneo. So we'll reserve all the question and answer portion towards the end of the segment. So once again, if you have any questions, feel free to type them on the Zoom chat. I'll now proceed to call on the next presenter. Presenting post-conflict pedagogies and transitions, interrogating the prospects of critical climate education in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, presented by Somaya Kali Padilla.
Hello po, good afternoon everyone. Can I ask lang po if the timer? So I'll just time myself para 10 minutes. Okay. So okay, so I'll start my presentation now. Good afternoon everyone. It's very nice meeting everyone here. So my name is Somaya Kali Padilla. Currently in my final year studying at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. I'm very sorry for the background. I'm somewhere else. But I will be presenting my paper entitled Post-Conflict Pedagogies and Transitions, Interrogating the Prospects of Critical Climate Education in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. Next slide, please. Okay, so before we proceed to the actual gist, since it's just a 10 minutes presentation, hopefully we can narrow down the discussion from what is happening right now in terms of the global climate crisis, how it boils down to the crisis of climate in the global south, and the implications of our colonial histories that we are trying to navigate, that we are trying to recover from until now, and how that actually affects our region, particularly the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region, in terms of our pedagogy and how we understand the boiling climate crisis that affects the most vulnerable sector in different parts of the Philippines and also all over the world, since our audience right now is definitely international. So starting with the global climate crisis, we know that the carbon emissions and the greenhouse gas have spiked over the decades and over the years, and it has caused rapid onset hazards and also slow onset changes that may not be immediately felt, but definitely impacts the communities in terms of our socioeconomic mobility and also in terms of our access to certain resources. So that is how the climate crisis is very much intertwined and interconnected. And later on, we're going to delve on to how to actually its implications on the individual lives of the people in our communities. So we also know that communities that have contributed least to the global emissions often face the greatest vulnerability, and this contributes to poverty, geographic isolation, and limited public services. So next slide. Okay, so I just put this analysis because we have also worked on data with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and we have seen the disparity in terms of the carbon emissions, that the emissions of the global north are significantly significantly higher than that of the global south, which includes us in the Philippines and also other countries within ASEAN, and that makes us more vulnerable to climate related disasters and vulnerabilities. Next slide, please. Okay, so we now draw the connections between colonialism, the global south, and climate inequality. This may seem very abstract or very big concepts at first, but we will see eventually that how colonial economies back then, and even how they colonized Mindanao and the Bangsamoro because of the land dispossession that was happening in our region, that the reorganization of territories actually caused the extraction of natural resources like minerals, agricultural commodities, because we come from a very agricultural historical background, and how these impacted and this evolved into extractive structures that contributed greatly to environmental degradation while generating wealth disproportionately, and that is how the imperial powers have consolidated wealth. And it impacted global production, global supply chains, and eventually the levels of consumption produced unequal flows of resources, labor, and capital. Next slide. Okay, so we now move on to the state of climate in the Bangsamoro. Now that we know the global context and even the national context, wherein until now we are still experiencing consequent typhoons, floods, landslides, and threats that are affecting our mobility and even our education system, which will later on be useful as we discuss the transitions right now in our education system. So we know that the Bangsamoro has experienced attempts of colonial subjugation, and this has caused high exposure to climate-related hazards because the resources that have been extracted have made it hard for the region to eventually recover and undergo this so-called post-conflict transition and post-conflict reconstruction that we are trying to build up on now. And so we know that climate vulnerability is amplified by the region's dependence on climate-sensitive livelihoods. So a lot, especially, for example, in Maguindanao, communities there rely heavily on agriculture. For example, in the island provinces of Basulta, Sulu, which has now opted out of the Bangsamoro, but that is still under discussion, and also Tawi-Tawi, they rely heavily on livelihoods in terms of the fishery sector. So that is how intertwined the lives of the communities of the Bangsamoro people are in terms of the level and the status of the climate, and in terms of how vulnerable they are to experiencing this kind of shocks and waves in terms of climate, and how does that tie up to the pedagogies and the education system. So next slide. Okay, so this is just a Mindanao displacement snapshot if you're not yet familiar, but this is very important because this is data as of July 2024, and it's not as accurate because it's from the UN. It's not accurate. But it shows that the climate vulnerability of a certain community is inherently tied with the displacement levels of a certain community. For example, the displacement in Maguindanao, which may have caused because of horizontal and vertical conflicts, and also the levels of flood, for example, the Typhoon Paeng that has hit Maguindanao, and I'm saying this from cases and from experiences. It was hard for the community to recuperate because they did not have climate literacy that reached enough levels for them to vacate the community on an earlier sense. And not just that, but the institutions are not well equipped. We say we have the Bangsamoro government, but are we actually equipped institutionally to cope with the abilities and disasters that come our way? So you see the different zones here, the different areas. There's Cotabato, there's other parts, not necessarily Bangsamoro, but definitely interconnected with Mindanao, Davao, Zamboanga, Basilan. The levels of displacement due to rain-induced landslide are also very high, ranging from 3,800 to 4,800. That will reach until 5,000. And when there's a specific conflict that's happening that's related with climate, it also impacts the state of education of the people in the Bangsamoro, because the schools are being made as evacuation sites, or the classes are being canceled, and therefore the level of awareness is not being propagated as urgently as it needs to be. So that's just a Mindanao displacement snapshot that you could check for yourself. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is the state of climate in the Bangsamoro? Now we can analyze that the effects of climate change are unevenly distributed across the region. So even within the Bangsamoro region, there is the state of preparedness of cities and the state of preparedness of the geographical provinces or the geographically isolated provinces are have a level of disparity that needs to be addressed as well, because the people in the city are equipped while those not in the city are not just under-resourced but also not well equipped in terms of the basic concepts of climate, pedagogy, and education. And as scholars, as people in the academe, the question is, how can we as academic practitioners actually propagate that knowledge to the communities? Next slide. 2 minutes left. Okay. So now we know that climate-related disasters can further compound displacement and insecurity, and particularly when certain disasters are predicted, and that connects with the level of technology that the Bangsamoro has at the moment, which is still very contentious, because in the very first place, what we mean and what we say when we say post-conflict pedagogies and transitions and critical climate education, next slide please. Okay, climate literacy in BARMM, we say that the people in the community are able to interconnect the historical injustices that have been experienced by the community and the level of climate literacy and the disasters that are affecting the region. So we see here the intersectionality and the interdisciplinarity of information, education, technology, and even how we equip the institutional support in the levels that it needs to keep up with. Next slide. Okay, so this is just a study from the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, lifted from the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. So it's a sample size. So I need to wrap up, but this shows that the level of climate literacy in the Bangsamoro is only 48% of BARMM respondents have heard of the concept of climate change, compared to 70 to 86% of other Philippine regions. So in terms of the level of critical climate literacy, the point of the research and the point of the working paper is that we have to connect indigenous knowledge and technologies and the level of evolution that the Bangsamoro is evolving into right now with the knowledge of the community and the information that they have to be equipped with. Sorry. And the relationship then between climate literacy, preparedness, and critical climate education remains very critical, because we cannot process and analyze the levels of disasters that are impacting a certain community when we cannot analyze the levels of historical violence and the levels of political violence that the community in the Bangsamoro is still experiencing right now. So to wrap up, to conclude the presentation, next slide, please. The conclusion and ways forward, climate education is very critical for post-conflict meaning making and also the reconciliation that the Bangsamoro is trying to move towards. And this consequently links with climate resilience, but not just that, but for peace building and also for the genuine self-determination that the community is aspiring towards. So I hope to work with you all. If you have questions, you can reach out to me via email or Facebook. I would very be happily to discuss further the study. Thank you very much, and that is all.
Thank you, Maya, for a very detailed presentation on climate education in BARMM. I'll now call on our next presenter, presenting Weakening Climate Resilience, STEM Education, Green Skills, and the Green Brain Drain of Filipino STEM Students and Professionals, presented by Mary Kabuslay from the Department of International Development, Innovation, and Sustainability of Miriam College.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to ask for assistance to share my presentation. Thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mary from Miriam College and Youth for Energy Southeast Asia, and today I'll be sharing my insights about my paper on weakening climate resilience, STEM education, green skills, and the green brain drain of Filipino STEM students and professionals. So in the next slide, I would like to start with stating our current global reality, that we are seeing a green transition. Countries are rapidly expanding their green job markets to meet net zero emissions and climate adaptation targets. And this has sparked an intense competition for STEM professionals. However, the industry demand is vastly outpacing the supply of human capital, leading to a green skills crisis. The Philippines is acutely aware of this both paradoxical and promising situation. As one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, we need skilled professionals in renewable energy, sustainable engineering, and environmental science just to survive. We aim to be a green jobs leader, and the Philippines introduced the pioneering Green Jobs Act of 2016 to address our 75% domestic shortage of skilled green workers. But here is where the disconnect happens. According to the recent data from the DOLE, or Department of Labor and Employment, 41% of Filipino youth are highly interested in green careers, but only 25% actually know of any local opportunities. And this is a massive structural invisibility. We have a pool of talented STEM students and professionals who want to contribute to our climate resilience, but they cannot find the local avenues, the research funding, or the physical infrastructure to do so. And this disconnect acts as a direct catalyst for what this research calls the brain drain, a phenomenon on outward migration, forcing our brightest minds to seek these opportunities abroad where green sectors are advanced, fully funded, and well supported. In the next slide, we will understand this green brain drain. We look at the Philippines' deeply rooted culture of migration, which has evolved across three distinct phases. Phase one, we saw the immigration of scientists and engineering talent to fill overseas labor shortages. At that time, our domestic economy was sluggish and it simply could not absorb the sheer volume of the talent that we were producing. And this was less of a brain drain, and it was more of a favorable immigration. By phase two, this outward flow intensified into a true brain drain. As defined by Lindsay Lowell, a geographer, a brain drain requires two conditions. The first is the significant loss of the highly educated population, and second, the adverse economic consequences brought by these outflows. This phase meets both criteria. Driven by structural weaknesses at home and aggressive recruitment abroad, nearly 60% of our STEM professionals, including the chemists, physicists, and engineers, migrated to developed states. And this severely depleted our domestic human capital and actively hindered our national research and development capabilities. And today we are in phase three, which focuses on brain circulation. The Philippines championed initiatives like the DOST Balik Science program to encourage experts to return and share their knowledge. However, this analysis shows that while these policies appear development-oriented on paper, their outcomes remain highly ambiguous. Returning migrants are bringing back advanced knowledge to institutions that are underfunded, lack modern laboratories, and offer fragmented support. This phase does not erase the brain drain. It simply highlights that we cannot rely on temporary return programs if we do not have this domestic foundation to sustain their expertise. So this brings us to the next slide, which shows the core mechanism driving the green brain drain. Why do our STEM professionals continue to leave? It comes down to the functionalist theories on push and pull factors. Locally, our STEM professionals face limited research funding, outdated facilities, and a heavy academic curriculum that lacks institutional backing. Conversely, destination countries offer cutting-edge laboratories, heavily funded research, and clear career pathways in renewable energy and climate science. This brings us to the core of systemic failure of our current framework. As this research proposes, brain drain is the sum of a lack of human investment plus the lack of infrastructure investment multiplied by our existing culture of migration and the limited availability of domestic green jobs. And this creates an alarming inverse relationship. As our green brain drain exponentially increases, our national climate resilience proportionally decreases. We are currently investing in curriculum reforms and funding the education of brilliant STEM students only to export them to nations equipped to utilize their skills. If we continue to treat human capital development in a vacuum without explicit large-scale investments in the domestic science and innovation ecosystem that they need, the Philippines will function merely as a training ground, losing the very experts we desperately need to secure our own climate future. While international bodies like the ILO are just beginning to recognize this concept of green brain drain, there's still no universal structure framework for it in academic literature. So this research takes this emerging global concern and operationalizes it for the Philippine context. I define it not just as a migration of talent, but a systemic failure, specifically the loss of STEM and sustainability oriented talent driven by a lack of domestic infrastructure, multiplied by our historical culture of migration, which directly weakens our climate resilience. So in the next slide, if national infrastructure frameworks remain sluggish, our educational institutions must serve as the primary intervention point. Schools cannot just be passive producers of human capital, they must actively intervene. First, they must bridge infrastructure gaps by aggressively pursuing PPPs, public-private partnerships, are developing shared research hubs with green tech industry can bypass bureaucratic funding bottlenecks. Second, we need to create direct career pipelines. Career placement offices must connect students directly to domestic green technology and environmental governance sectors, moving away from generalized corporate routes. Third, universities must reshape the ecological culture by integrating localized community-based climate resilience projects into the core STEM curriculum. We can dismantle that deeply ingrained belief that professional success only happens abroad. When students apply their research to vulnerable local communities, it anchors their professional aspirations to domestic needs. And finally, we must promote objective literacy. Climate resilience is multidisciplinary. We must embed rigorous sustainability frameworks across all non-STEM disciplines to show that fighting climate change requires a unified cross-sectoral domestic workforce. So to wrap up, and if we can go to the next slide, these are our policy recommendations and conclusions. While academic institutions can localize opportunities, sustainable retention ultimately depends on state-level policy. First, the government must fund domestic R&D heavily. The Philippines currently allocates only 0.3% of its GDP to R&D, well below the UNESCO standard of 1%. You must invest in critical physical infrastructure to provide the modern laboratories our returning experts need. Second, we must institutionalize brain circulation. Return mechanisms like the Balik Science Program must be linked to long-term academic and institutional partnerships, advancing beyond just short-term missions. Third, we must align our intersections. National migration policy must be directly aligned with climate resilience strategies so we stop exporting our strategic human capital. So in conclusion, relying heavily on overseas remittances cannot save the Philippines from the escalating climate crisis. And addressing the green brain drain is not a matter of choosing between migration and retention. It's about building the domestic conditions that make retention possible. Government investment, localized educational opportunities, and private sector partnerships must move together as a single coordinated strategy. And only then can we secure our ecosystem and convert our immense STEM talent pool into lasting climate resilience. Thank you very much, and I'm be very happy to discuss further insights during our Q&A.
Thank you very much, Mary, for that presentation and for introducing us to the topic of a green brain drain and its implications for educators and education systems. So last but not the least, right, I will be calling on our last presenter, joining us all the way from the University Science Malaysia, Ms. Sally B. Gutierrez, presenting the future of higher education leadership in Malaysia, a preliminary inquiry on the Envisioning Malaysia 2050, a foresight narrative.
Do you have my slides or should I share my own slides?
I think you can share your own slides, ma'am.
Oh, okay, it's here. They shared it for me. Okay, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm actually based in Malaysia now. But I'm a Filipino. Yeah, so I resonate well with the previous presentation, which I'm a contributor to the brain drain effect. Okay, so if you know, just a bit of introduction. Envisioning Malaysia is the foresight document of Malaysia in science and education. In science and technology. Its equivalent in the Philippines is the Pagtanaw 2050. If everyone, if somebody has happened to know about that. Okay, next slide, please. So the vision of Malaysia in terms of S&T, specifically focused on the higher education leadership and governance, is that they want to become empowered civil society, which is data-driven, and they want to become they want to harness the real-time monitoring of data centers that they are trying to create right now. And also they want to become the universities want to become responsive and inclusive with a vibrant economic landscape, since most of the universities now are encouraged to generate their own incomes aside from securing funds from the government. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so in the macro level, since we've been talking about these macro environmental disruptions, in a traditional university, we know that every kind of disruption that we encounter is usually affects the university. For example, in the recent past, we have the global pandemic, social inequality, which is very much experienced, especially in the BARMM area, which was presented a while back. The digital transformation, we now call, we have a new term or a new construct, which is the digital divide, and the geopolitical instability, which is everyone experiencing right now, especially in the crisis in the Middle East. So central to that is, of course, higher education institution is also affected because of all these disruptions. Okay, next slide, please. So for them, to answer that is they want to design a leadership capable society wherein they're able to mitigate some of these disruptions when these will happen again. Okay, first is they want to focus on value-driven and rooted in people actions. They also want to have a holistic education ecosystem, which now bridges the university, the industry, and the society. And then distributed and participatory practice, which is, of course, everyone is very much interested in all these approaches. And then adaptive lifelong learning, because nowadays they are adapting into the micro-credential forms of learning, which is so much embraced by the next generation or the younger generations. And of course, the governance and national direction of the government and connected with the institutions of higher education. So in these values, they want to have a leadership that's a shared among all the participating sectors of the community. Next slide, please. So from the document, they found out that the paradigm shift is so much important. So before they tried to deep dive into the structure of their community from the ivory tower, and now they want to transform the community or the society into an interconnected ecosystem. So with the following components: holistic, socially wide capacity, rooted in people and values, and distributed across communities, and driven by lifelong learning. So in this, they want to formulate a strategic transition from structural management to ethical and adaptive capability. Okay, next slide, please. So when they tried to study the document, they found out that the origins of their leadership in the past is primarily rooted in the 1930s. The power is located in the, or it's primarily authoritarian, and the focus is, of course, stability, task completion, control, and institutional preservation. So they envision their higher education systems and the community to become emerging from system-based, ecosystemic, and connectivist approaches, which focuses the power on participatory networks and with a focus or the direction towards agile responsiveness, collaboration, shared responsibility, and values. Okay, next slide, please. So these foundational assumptions for 2050 university leadership, it's built upon answering the different or macro level questions and macro level issues, especially located in the geopolitical and ethical engagement, diversified credentialing, contextual and cultural alignment, and comprehensive digital capacity. So in here, they want to build a network that will be strategic, and the judgment of how they will be evaluating this is through the in a sense that they will focus on how the universities and the different institutional networks will be interconnected with one another. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the pillars of this is, of course, we have people and values. They're now contributing a lot, or they're now exploring a lot on how to explore the people and the different values that they have. We know that Malaysia is a multicultural community, multicultural country. So they want to solidify the different cultures and find the strength on this multiracial form of society. Okay, next slide, please. Then the pillar 2 is holistic education system, in a sense that they want to merge formal schooling with family, home, and environments, community, cultural practices to build an agile and ethically grounded citizen. So that's the ultimate aim in 2050. And the next slide, please. Okay, the third one is a distributed and participatory practice, the third pillar. So as I mentioned before, the study of the document is primarily rooted on authoritarian. Now they want a distributed and participatory mode of engagement across all societal actors. And in Malaysia, they have only few public universities, which they envision to work well with the private universities and community colleges and the TVET sectors. Okay, next slide, please. So the next one is, of course, adaptive learning, adaptive and lifelong learning. So nowadays, everyone is so familiar with micro-credentialing, and universities in Malaysia, both in the private and public sector, public universities are so much engaged into micro-credentialing to enrich the knowledge of their human actors. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and finally, of course, we need governance, accountability, and national direction, which is so much the principal actor which will stabilize all this when government is coordinating with all the different sectors of the community. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so in synthesis, the engine of national transformation in the Malaysian document is focus on leadership, which is no longer the domain of a select few. They want it to be participatory, integrated in the value systems, and everyone should be engaged in decision making. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so to operationalize in the next few years, and as they move toward 2050, they have these different steps, three steps. So first is curriculum redesign, which is the immediate one. Second is structural policy and governance, also new term. And the third one is the institutional institutional strategy, which is in the long term. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation, and I hope to discuss more of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sally, for giving us some insight on Malaysian model. It's really nice to hear about what's happening in the region as well. So now we are opening the floor for a question and answer portion. So if you have any comments, questions, we'll use the time that we have now to start a discussion. So I think we have some time for around 2 to 3 more questions. So we have a question here for Jean-Ric Nunez. Based on your study, how do educators navigate the tensions between technology and traditional/cultural values in BARMM?
Thank you. Based on our interviews themselves, we can say that the teachers indeed kind of struggle. In fact, of the teachers that we talked to, they seem to have well, they're open to the use of technology in the classroom, and they appreciate how it makes things more efficient for them, especially with doing e-records or presenting slides and all that. But they've expressed strong resistance with how student attitudes are shaped by technology. And initially, they expressed that frustration, but however, it seemed like not only do these technological influences change the way they approach the classroom, but also how legal, that's it, like legal documents also try to regulate the way they facilitate learning instruction. What I mean by this is that it seems to them that even educational laws, and systemic practices seem to be aligned with how students are changing. So, in as much as they want to express that frustration and apply that in the classroom and stick to their traditional practices, they'd rather adapt to these changing systems instead, because even the policies demand them to change their practices as well. So that means, for example, even though they are uncomfortable with students seemingly becoming much more expressive, they are already learning how to play the game and be more casual with the way they approach their students, for example. Because again, not only do technological forces come into play, but even policies also force them to adapt to these circumstances.
So thank you, Jean-Rick. We have a question from the floor for Maya. What is the role of Islamic learning in post-conflict pedagogies? Is Maya still in the room? Okay, so I think we'll move on. So Maya, if you're there, feel free to just raise your hand or unmute later. But we do have another question for Mary Kabuslay. The question reads, the Balik Scientist program seems to have mixed results in the green circulation / return of human capital for our climate resilience. Are there similar programs other countries are also doing? And would you have information on how they are performing?
Thank you for the question. Actually, since my study is really focused on the domestic or the national level policies, it does not really, I don't have any comparing analysis on that. But I do agree that this is that the result can be very multidimensional. In fact, when you look at the benefits or the brain circulation under the Balik Scientist program, you will see that the maximum years of the return and knowledge sharing is 3 years. And that itself is still very short term, especially knowing how the climate crisis is much more exacerbated. And evidently, you can if you are in the Philippines, you would understand this. Especially for a week, we have been experiencing heavy rain. So this is actually a good insight that I also would consider checking. But I think what I can also share aside from the Balik Scientist program would be the national sorry the National Green Jobs Human Resource Development Plan for 2020 to 2023. It's not really directly a program under DOST, but it's an interagency development plan. So it includes three relevant points from the 8-point socio-economic agenda on green jobs and just transition, which includes creating more jobs, creating quality jobs, and creating green jobs. So the DOST alone cannot even, that Balik Scientist program policy alone cannot address the current or the emerging green brain drain that we are experiencing. So yeah.
Yes, Sally, go ahead.
This is just a comment for Mary. Yeah, actually, just to add for your study, there is also another program of DOST, which is the SNT Fellows program, which I was once an SNT Fellow program in the National Academy of Science and Technology. So Same with the balik scientists, it's not really that very attractive in a sense that it's contractual and we are not really based in we are not into a contract that is like employee-employer contract. So yeah, many
Yeah.
SNT fellows have left already as well.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I also agree. I think this is one point that I have been emphasizing in my discussion earlier, that logically you cannot force them to stay despite offering compensation and benefits for you, your family, your dependents, and a higher salary or a higher competitive salary that matches the global industry demand, because we don't have the playground for learning and innovation for them. So that's why we are aligned with the same insight on that.
Yeah, actually, most of the scientists who left, they want productivity rather than high salary.
Right. So thank you, Mary, and thank you, Sally, as well. We do have a question for Sally. So, Sally, in your experience, do you see tensions within institutions in balancing what we call the pushes of the present and the pulse from the future, or immediate and near-term thinking and long-term thinking, to ease the implementation of, as you said, actionable education strategies?
Okay, tensions between, actually, because this is a foresight document, we can only learn about what's happening in the present and forecast what will happen in the future. So as to the tensions, the short-term tensions may be or black swans that we may encounter in the coming decade, maybe, is the growing tension of these geopolitical issues. So that may be black swans. And because of climate change, which has been so much discussed in the previous previous session, I think the emergence and re-emergence of pandemics and epidemics that is forecasted by scientists, especially in the field of medicine, might also be there because of the effect of climate change. Scientists are now claiming that because of global warming and this climate change, some of the eradicated illnesses, diseases, and these pandemic issues have already re-emerged because of extreme cold and extreme hot temperatures.
Okay. So thank you very much, Sally. All right, I think we have time for one final question, and this is a question for Mary. So, Mary, the question reads, if the underlying pull factors are the same ones driving general brain drain in the Philippines for decades, right? Better pay, better research infrastructure, career stability. What is distinctive, or what do you think is the difference between the general brain drain that we're experiencing in the Philippines and a green brain drain?
Actually, as I define green drain, it's especially for the green transition or green economy that we are experiencing right now. I just probably green brain drain, I can say, is a subtopic or a sub-phenomenon under the brain drain definition of Lowell, which I explained earlier. And I think the distinct characteristic would be again the ecosystem, the holistic ecosystem that the developed states or the receiving countries, if I can name them, the United States, the UK, and some Western countries, particularly in Western Europe. So they offered that kind of ecosystem that we do not have. And that's the distinction between the brain drain, which includes a diverse pool of our expertise here in the Philippines. It does not only include the engineers, the scientists, the researchers, but it also includes those who are in the business field, who are experts in healthcare. They are not necessarily directly contributing to climate resilience, but I think a perfect example of this would be our nurses. So Yep. That would be my insight for now for that question.
Great. So I think that's all the time that we have for questions, and we'll proceed with closing and wrapping up this session. So thank you all for your enthusiasm and participation for this parallel session. Before we part ways, I would like to award the certificates of recognition to our presenters today. So the citation reads, Certificate of Recognition is presented to, in this case, Ms. Sadaf Ansari, for delivering a poster presentation entitled The University as Community Hub, a New Model for Education in the Age of AI, at the 2026 AUN-EEC Conference on Ecological Education and Culture, with the theme Examining the Avenues Forward, Sustainable Futures in the ASEAN Region, given this 12th day of August 2026, online via Zoom. And this is signed by Dr. Emmanuel De Locado, the Executive Director of the ASEAN University Network on Ecological Education and Culture, as well as Ms. Marite Irvin, Executive Director of the Ateneo Research Institute of the Futures of Education. Okay. So on the next slides, right, I will be reading these certificates of recognition that will be awarded to Mr. Ronald Gabriel Teng, Assistant Professor Marielle Antoinette Zosa, Mr. Genric Nunez, Ms. Somaya Padilla, Ms. Mary Crisangelic Cabuslay, and last but not least, Dr. Sally Gutierrez. So once again, I am Bea Carag, and it has been a pleasure to have moderated this session for you this afternoon. Before we part ways, let's all have a group photo. So may I please ask everyone to turn on their cameras. All right, bright smiles, everyone.
I'll be taking the screenshots in 3, 2, 1. I'll take another one just for those who have just turned on their cameras. I'll take another one in 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. Thank you, Daniel, for taking a photo. Lastly, so there will be a break from 3:15 to 3:25 p.m. On the slides are the rest of the breakout sessions for this afternoon, if you'd still like to catch them. Thank you.